joining us today for Mourning in the Morning. Welcome to those of you who are joining us online. In case anyone needs them, the restrooms are down the hallway, past the lobby, and on the right-hand side. Welcome to today's presentation of Mourning in the Morning, Rochester Mystery, the Disappearance of Emma Moore. Our next program will be Rochester's Rich History, from Almshouse to Psychiatric Center, the history of mental health care in Rochester, which will happen next Saturday the 20th at 1 p.m. right here in the Kessler Cox Auditorium. Today we will explore the mysterious disappearance of Emma Moore, the daughter of a respected Rochester family, a case that made national headlines and stands as perhaps Rochester's oldest cold case. Our speaker today is Dennis Carr. Dennis is a founding member, past president, and current trustee of the Friends of Mount Hope Cemetery. He is the senior tour guide at Mount Hope, with 2021 marking his 43rd year leading tours of Mount Hope Cemetery. Dennis is also on staff at the Edward G. Meyer Library of the University of Rochester Medical Center, assisting students, researchers, clinical staff, and faculty. He's a lifelong scholar of the American Cemetery. Ladies and gentlemen, Dennis Carr.
Take that off if you don't mind. Thank you.
We've been doing a tour at Mount Hope for about 10 years called Mischief, Murder, and Mayhem. And one of the things I found when I was researching that tour was this story of Emma Moore. And I didn't find it in anything published in Rochester. I found it in the New York Times. And this was an event in Rochester that was in papers all across the United States and Canada. In the mid-nineteenth-century, this sort of thing didn't happen on a regular basis. Unfortunately, we're experiencing a crime wave these days, but it seems like every morning there's a new murder, and we don't get, sadly, we don't get that excited about it. But in the mid-nineteenth-century, this was big stuff. This woman from a really upper middle class family just disappears, and there were lots of rumors, and communications is not what it was. So rumors spread through the community, and it's reported almost daily in the Rochester papers, and for our benefit, after the fact, in 1855, the Rochester Daily Union published a 32-page special edition about just this event, and going through all the steps and all the questioning and all the coroner's inquest and everything that pertained to this case. So to get started. Emma Moore lived at 73 North Street, and that would be in the block probably right between Achilles and Grove here. We'll see on the map, and it's not far from where the Rochester Savings Bank parking lot is on North Street today, the old Rochester Savings Bank. And her father had been a tailor. He had come from England 27 years before, and settled in Rochester. And he had done quite well. He was a merchant tailor, and he had acquired a fair amount of real estate in Rochester. And in addition to the houses he owned on North Street, and he had sold one to his daughter's husband, Richard Whitney, and that's number 73 where Emma lived, with her sister and brother-in-law. She also had two other brothers in town, and although they were, as siblings always are, sometimes they were very close and sometimes they were not so close, and their husbands and wives had differences, but after this occurrence, they all seemed to cling to each other. So there were no major problems with any of them. In the afternoon of the 14th of November 1854, Emma had been downtown. She went to the merchant tailor that she sewed for. Emma was a highly skilled tailor, she was called in the city directory. She did highly skilled work to the point where she was able to support herself and put aside a fair amount of money at the same time. And on that afternoon, she had gone downtown and visited the shop where she did a fair amount of work. Her work for. His name was James Henderson, and there's his advertisement in the 1855 city directory, and his shop was in the Reynolds Arcade downtown, and the Reynolds Arcade was sort of the prime business location in Rochester. There's a more recent picture of it from the early 20th century, and but it had an observatory on the top, and this was the classy place to do business in the 19th century. So there's the interior, and that's an 1851 drawing of it. And Mr. Henderson's shop was number 18. Up there. There it is, number 18. And right across from the post office. That was a prime location, because everybody went to the post office. And anyway, she took 2 vests that she promised James Henderson she would have back the following afternoon before 4. Then she left and she went up State Street. She probably exited through the back entrance on Exchange Place, went out onto State Street, and at 36 State Street, she went to Wilder and Gordon's, which was a dry goods store, and bought a pair of gloves. And the proprietor told her that if they didn't suit her, that she was welcome to bring them back. So, and exchange them. So after that, she went home to North Street. She had dinner with her sister and brother-in-law, and after dinner, she spent about an hour and a half sewing on these vests to get them ready for the following day. And about 7:30, she put on her shawl and her hat and told her sister that she was going to return the gloves. That she decided that she didn't want them, so she's going to exchange the gloves. Left the house, and this was the last anybody saw. And she this was the 14th, which was Tuesday. The following morning, nobody got really upset about it. They thought Emma was 37 years old. She was an adult. She had, there's no telephone to call and say, I'm not coming home or I'm going to be late. So she had, in fact, stayed with friends before. And the night of the 14th was a stormy night. So her sister thought that she probably stayed with a family member or a friend overnight. So the next morning, by lunchtime, when she didn't appear, they started to worry a little bit, and by that evening, they start to panic a little bit. So Richard Whitney goes to James Henderson's store and asks if he saw Emma back that evening, and he hadn't seen her since she picked up the vests in the afternoon. That was about 5:15. And then he went to Wilder and Gordon's, asked them if they had seen her. They hadn't seen her after her initial purchase of the gloves. So she hadn't been to the place that she was intending to go. So on the 16th, Thursday, Richard Whitney put an ad in the Rochester Union inquiring if anybody knew where Emma was. And as you can imagine, by this time they're pretty upset. And on the 17th, Friday, the neighbors are aware of this now, and the neighbors begin organizing themselves in groups, and they start to search the neighborhood. And they, there's State Street, where the Wilder Gordon's is. We'll come back to that. So the neighbors search barns and yards and everything in the neighborhood of North Street. And by that Saturday, everybody's in an uproar over this thing. The neighbors, a group of the neighbors actually forcibly go into R.O. Whitney's house and search the house top to bottom, thinking that potentially the family had something to do with Emma's disappearance. And of course, they didn't, and never did. And people were satisfied with that. So then there's a complicating factor. Somebody reports that at 10 o'clock on the night of the 14th, the night of the disappearance, that somebody heard a woman scream on North Street within about 200 feet of 73 North Street. And but nobody knew, by the time anybody looked outside, they saw nothing. But imagine rumors start to spread about that. And everybody's got an idea what those screams were. And in fact, one of Mrs. Whitney's brothers had stopped over at their house not long before that, and his theory was that he had scared somebody who thought that they were being followed, but nobody could figure that out. Nobody knew that. November 2nd, or November 21st, I'm sorry. By that time, the community is in an uproar. And you think that we live in this CSI world where you think that things like this happen, the police show up, and they do some sort of an investigation and throw up the police tape. And the police were sort of not that interested. Nobody, all the Whitneys reported this to the police made no inquiries, no investigation. They said, she'll probably show up. And that's sort of the way it went. And that's more about the police in a little bit. So 21st, that's the following Tuesday, some men searched the river from Main Street Bridge to the High Falls on both sides and found nothing. 24th, on Friday, there was a public meeting downtown at Palmer's Hall on Main Street, and a committee was formed, a committee of about 15 people, and some of these people were pretty prominent people. One was a former mayor of Rochester. Some were lawyers and business people, and they requested the mayor issue a reward for the return of Emma, or information leading to whoever did whatever they did. On Saturday, November 27th, there was a large meeting at City Hall. So many people that a substantial number of them couldn't get into the hall, had to stay outside. And they started to organize and come up with some theories and pressure the mayor and the police to actually do something about this. So on the following Sunday, the 28th, a call was put out, and as reported in the papers, hundreds of people showed up to search for Emma Moore. And they formed a line from the river out to beyond North Street, and they walked all the way to the Irondequoit town line, searching barns and fields and ponds and things like that. And at the end of the day, everybody was pretty tired, but nobody found anything. Nobody had an idea what happened to Emma. A company of 20 people searched the river with boat hooks from north of the falls to a couple miles north of the lower falls, and found nothing. Brown's Race was searched. The east side of the river above the falls was searched again with boat hooks. On the 29th, There was another search that went all the way to the Atlantic Lake border. And there was a report, somebody had heard a woman scream, supposedly the night of the disappearance, about a mile south of Lake Ontario. You see, there are all of these unreliable people coming forward with all sorts of theories and all sorts of connections to this thing. Early December, Mayor Strong and a police justice held a private examination, and they came up with really nothing new and really no plan of attack for this thing. Through the winter, there were reports of sightings of Emma in Buffalo, Cincinnati, and Davenport, Iowa. None of them were accurate. And finally, on February 5th, Sheriff Woodward puts out an ad in papers all over the place, offering a $1,000 reward for information on Emma's return. And the family had previously offered $300, which is still a substantial amount of money. So now there's a $1,300 reward for the return of Emma. February 20th, there was a large public meeting. Nothing really new. The committee concluded that Emma had been taken by force and probably murdered. Not something her family wanted to hear. But once again, nobody has any proof of any of this. Nobody has any substantial witnesses or sightings or anything like that. So, 125 days after her disappearance, a couple of boys waiting for their older brother to finish his work at one of the mills downtown were playing in the yard around the mill, and there's a mill race. Every time I say mill race, somebody says, "What's that?" And a mill race is a channel cut from the river, and it channels water at a very restricted and high rate, and it turns a wheel that provides power to the mill. So that's a mill race. And downtown was full of these things. There were 22 mills on the Genesee River and on the canal. At the time that Rochester was called the Flower City, F-L-O-U-R, because of all the grain milling that went on. So there are mill races all over the place to drive the wheels that run these mills. In fact, the building we're standing on sits where there was a flour mill. And if you stand on, today is probably a good day to do it, if you stand on the Court Street Bridge or the Broad Street Bridge and look back at the library building, you'll notice that there's water coming out of big arched openings at the base of the building. That's a mill. That was the mill race that ran the mill that sat on this site. So there was an adult man named William Devine who was in this area. He was collecting wood shavings for fire at home, and he looked down into the mill race and he saw what looked to him like a body. This is winter. The mill race is frozen, but the water rushes so fast that the ice sort of comes and goes, and there was a big hole in the ice. At that point, you looked down in that hole, you could see what looked like a body. And think of what happens today and what happened in 1855. He called one of these young boys over to look down and see if he thought it was a body too. And of course he did. So they called to the men in the mill. A bunch of them came out, and within 3 minutes they had brought the body up out of the mill race, put it on a large board. And once again, you think the police are going to come, slap up the police tape, do a forensic investigation? Nothing. So by the time they were ready to what they did was they put the body on board and they walked it over to the city and county hall where the county coroner's office was. By the time they got ready to move, there were almost 1,000 people had gathered, and people were very concerned about this. And they followed them over to made it very difficult for them to even get to the county coroner's office, but they followed them over there. The county coroner, named Pullis, did a quick post-mortem. And depending on which paper you read, some of the papers say that Coroner Pullis missed a very important point. And he pretty much immediately brought in three very prominent doctors who did a second post-mortem. And they reported that Emma was, at the time of her death, 6 to 7 months pregnant. Another complicating factor in this whole thing. So some of the papers reported that Coroner Pullis missed that point. It would be pretty hard to miss, but so there was some decomposition to the body, but I think that it was cold, and the coroner, the doctors reported that her skin was sort of coming apart, but she was very recognizable, and her clothing was a mess, but it was still intact. And a lot of the things that she had been carrying when she died were still on the body. The only thing that was missing was her watch and I think a coat collar or something like that. But she had what's called a Victorine. It's a little perfume bottle that women would carry in smelly places like downtown Rochester and use it to sort of reflect the smells. And actually there was a purse that they referred to as a porte-monnaie, and it was a small purse, and it still had her money in it. She had carried $20 when she left the house the night of her disappearance, and she still had that $20 on her when she died. When she had gotten the gloves originally or when she had gone to buy the gloves, before that she had been to the merchant tailor, James Henderson, and she borrowed money from him in lieu of what he would pay her the next day anyway, to go buy the gloves. And those bills were very distinctive because they were in the mid-19th century, a lot of currency that was banknotes. And they were drawn on various banks, sometimes not local banks. And so James Henderson remembered what he had given her. And they found those bills. One was drawn on a bank in Michigan, and another drawn on a bank locally. They found those bills in this porte-monnaie, this purse that she still had on her at the time of her death. So all her jewelry was still on the body. Couldn't believe it. A mill race. It's a very violent thing. The point, the way a mill race works, that water has to be restricted in order to flow very fast and push a mill wheel. Some of the mill wheels, if you've been up to Brown's Race, you see a mill wheel that is displayed up there, and it's horizontally in the mill race. Others would be vertically, like you would expect a big mill wheel to go. But a lot of the most efficient ones were horizontal inside down in the mill race, and you would expect the violence of that race to have totally obliterated the body and anything that was on it. But apparently that it was winter, that everything was frozen, made it possible for all those things to survive. At 6 p.m., Coroner Pullis called a jury of 15 people. And the way they did that usually was to go out onto the street and just grab people. And in this case, they're downtown, and they were able to get some pretty high-level people, some pretty prominent citizens to be on this coroner's jury. And the three doctors reported that one of the things they noticed was that her tongue was between her teeth, and they said that was a sign of drowning. That people that are victims of drowning, generally that's what happens. And so they thought that the cause of death was drowning. And there's the courthouse. This is the second Monroe County courthouse, the one that sits right about where the county office building sits, just slightly back from Main Street. And here's Emma's listing in the Mount Hope interment books. And it says, cause of death, drowning. And I'm not so sure that a medical examiner today would have come to that conclusion. I don't know that that was, although they did say that they could not determine whether she had been forcibly pushed into the mill race, or whether she had jumped into the mill race, or had been injured ahead of time, or anything like that. There was no way to tell that. There's no DNA. There's no a lot of the things that come more in our time were not there. So James Henderson identified that poor Mourning in all the bills. So they had an idea that she probably died that afternoon, that she had been dead for all of those 125 days. Her body was sent out to Mount Hope and held in what they refer to as the dead house. And the dead house is undoubtedly the vault that was replaced by the holding vault that sits behind the 1862 chapel at Mount Hope. And they didn't use backhoes to dig graves at Mount Hope until well after World War II. So you all know how difficult it is to dig a hole in Rochester in the depths of winter. So most of those interments would be held in the holy vault, and before that in the dead house, which was a vault that they used to store these interments. And they sent her out. They sent her body out there. Then the doctors went out and did another postmortem out at the dead house at Monroe. And what they were looking for this time was signs of abortion or attempted abortion. And her 6 to 7 months pregnant with a female child that they said was well formed and not damaged in any way. And they thought that if anything they saw that didn't look quite right, they thought would naturally occur from her spending all that time in the mill race. So they saw no signs of abortion or attempted abortion or anything like that, because that was one of the theories of this thing, and it still could have been. The editor of the Rochester Union, who put out this 32-page special edition, he had some definite ideas about what had happened. There's the family plot of it on Hope, and there's Emma's great work there. And there's no monument on it. Her family had the funeral. They made no announcement. The only people that attended the funeral were close family members and friends. And there's no monument on the grave even now. But as with all the plots in Mount Hope, with very few exceptions, we know where everybody is because of the plot marks. So her father, who was quite elderly, he died. He died just a few years later. And her brother-in-law and sister-in-law both died in the 1860s, and they're buried in this plot. So the editor of the Rochester Union had several ideas about. He reported several theories about what people thought happened. One was that something I haven't told you yet. Emma, 37 years old. She had a boyfriend. The boyfriend was 10 years younger than she was. Now, so the boyfriend's name was William Whitelock. William Whitelock and Emma Moore had been engaged to be married 3 times. And he came up with reasons each time to postpone the marriage. And in 1853, she had come across William Whitelock on the street with a very young girl who he was taking to the theater at a time when he was actively seeing Emma. And it upset her a lot. And one of her friends reported on this at the coroner's inquest, and said that Emma was quite upset about it, and that she had said at that time that she wished she was dead. But that was a year and a half or more before she disappeared. So I don't think that's evidence of suicide. And so one of the theories was that she had gotten pregnant by William Whitelock and committed suicide. I have my doubts about that, because I think throwing yourself in the mill race would be a very painful and foreseeable painful way to go. And although it's possible. I think a woman, especially a woman of 37, pregnant in 1854 or 55, this would have been certainly a life-changing event. It would have been the end of life as she knew it. She was a Sunday school teacher at the Universalist Church, had a great reputation all around town. She was well known to people in Rochester for the work she did and for her family and things like that. The editor of the Rochester Union said that she was prepossessing appearance, but she wasn't handsome. And I took that to mean that she was attractive, but not a raving beauty, but attractive, and people commented on that. And she was almost universally cheerful in her demeanor, and people talked about that repeatedly. Multiple people talked about that. And so, and even the day that she disappeared, people reported on how cheerful she had been that day, which doesn't go to a conclusion that she killed herself. Could have, but I don't think there's a ton of evidence to that effect. The editor also thought that he reported that one of the theories was that she had gone to an abortionist, and that she had been given some sort of medicine that killed her during the abortion, and that the abortionist had put her body into the mill race. There is no evidence for that either, and I think that this would be a resort that I don't think she would have taken. Possible, once again, and all of this is unknown. And then, of course, the vast majority of people in town saw the boyfriend as well. They thought that William Whitelock, he'd already shown that he didn't want to marry Emma, and that they suspected that he had killed her, that he had shoved her into the river, into the mill race or something, and there may be some circumstantial evidence for that, because when she went downtown and she had gone to James Henderson's, picked up those vests, and then went to the State Street store while they're in Gordon's. William Whitelock reported to the coroner, and they quite a man questioned that he had been down there. He had been on Main Street, so he would have been on Main Street He swore they didn't see him. He would have been on Main Street almost at the very same time that she was moving between Reynolds Arcade and State Street, and they questioned him at length. One of the things that the sheriff said, and the sheriff did the initial question. The sheriff said that when they brought the family in to identify the body, that he said they became very emotional, and he described it as sort of appropriately distraught. And but when William Whitelock was brought in, he showed very little emotion, almost none, and acted almost as if he was being inconvenienced by being brought in to identify the body. And you can imagine that the spotlight began to shine pretty heavily on William Whitelock. And they questioned him numerous times to see if they could get him to admit to this. And he would never admit that he had done anything, or that he had even seen her that day, or that he had any that they had any issues or problems or anything like that. And clearly they did. So I think that William Whitelock may not have been the most, although there's no way to prove it, but I don't think he was the most honest in his testimony in the coroner's inquest. So no charges were ever filed in this case. 3 weeks ago, I think, I was reading the DNC. I spent that 5 minutes every day when I read the DNC, which is about all it takes. And there was an article in there about Rochester's oldest cold case. It was from 1972. And I'm thinking, these guys are Quakers. The oldest cold case has got to be this one, 1854, because there's been no resolution of this. No charges were ever brought. You can imagine that in the present day, this would have been solved in a heartbeat, with DNA evidence, or there are cameras everywhere. If you committed a murder, or you killed yourself, or whatever you did downtown, undoubtedly there are very few places in downtown Rochester today where there aren't cameras, and so it would have been eminently solvable today. But in 1854 and 1855, that didn't happen. And part of that goes to the feet of the police department. And the police, you think the police are having problems now? The first police chief, the first person to hold that title, police chief, was a guy named Eddie Van Slyke, who had been with the police department for a number of years by 1853. So 1853, the first police chief is appointed. There have been captains, because the police department evolves from the night watch. As the village develops in the 18 teens and 20s, they have what they call the night watch. And initially, citizens of good standing would volunteer to be part of the night watch, and they would walk the streets at night. And what they were really worried about was fire, more than crime. If they caught somebody doing something bad, well, that was good too. But mostly they're worried about fire, because a fire could take out the entire village. Because the fire service pretty much didn't exist either. People were required to have a fire bucket in their home, and they were required by law to respond with that fire bucket if fire broke out. And so through the 1820s, this whole idea of policing was developing, and they have a series of constables, and through most of the first half of the 19th century, a lot of times the constables are elected officials, and it's more a political appointment than anything. Police officers, when they begin to appoint police officers, and that's probably in the early 1830s, those are political appointments as well. And about every 2 years, you have an entirely new police force, because the new mayor would have fired everybody and appointed all of his own people. And so between 1853 and 1856, between 1853 and 1856, We have 4 different police chiefs. Eddie Van Slyke is police chief for less than a year. And he didn't die, he didn't retire. He got busted back to patrolman and stayed in the police force. He's reported in the city directory as a depot policeman, which is probably more akin to a security guard at the railroad depot. And eventually is sort of back on the force, but never in a high-ranking manner. And William Sherman is the next one. He's police chief for less than a year. And once again, he doesn't die, he doesn't retire. He's busted back to patrolman. And he spends the rest of his career. He's on the police force for another 20 or so years, 20 or 30 years. And eventually does get to serve as police chief. But not until a new administration comes in that was more politically aligned with him. And so in 1856, the city council had enough of this nonsense, and they fired the police chief, and they appointed Elisha Keeney. We talk about Elisha Keeney at the cemetery in terms of his service as deputy U.S. Marshal, who arrested Susan B. Anthony in 1872 for voting. But in 1856, he was well connected politically. He was a building contractor. He had served in one of these elected constable jobs. And so city council fired the police chief, and they made him the police chief. And he did a pretty good job of it. He reorganized the police. And policing in Rochester was a pretty ad hoc thing, it was a pretty casual thing up until that time. Like I say, very political. There were nobody wore uniforms. Police didn't wear uniforms until 1861, when Mayor Nash ordered the police to supply their own uniforms and hats. And he got that idea from Keeney, because Keeney was appointed police chief in 1856. He resigned after he thought he'd straightened things out in 1857. And in 1859, they reappointed him because things started to deteriorate again. He was police chief for another year in 1859, and the following year. And right after that, Mayor Nash orders the police to be put in uniform, because Keeney, he was a smart guy. He was a very systematic guy. He was a building contractor, built all sorts of things around Rochester. Knew how to manage groups of workers, and knew how to get all the pieces in the right place. And so he did his research, and he read about the Metropolitan Police in London. In the 1820s, Sir Robert Peel, the Home Secretary, had instituted the Metropolitan Police in the City of London. He came up with a series of tenets that police had to follow, and he put them in uniform. Once again, police in London, in England, had never been in uniform before that. And systematized the police force in London. Keeney read about that, did that for the Rochester police, and straightened things out twice. And so in 1854, when Emma Moore disappears, the police department is this very disorganized combination of elected constables and paid police officers. A police officer in 1854 made about $600 a year, which I think was probably the median income for a worker, for a working class person at that time. It wasn't pauper's wages, but you weren't living well. The police chief made $900, and he was expected to do a lot of the same things that the patrolman did. So this is the police department. So reporting Emma's disappearance to the police department, it's like reporting it to this table. You know, they had enough to do. They probably were more interested in what they wanted to do than what they were bound to do. And it was only after Mayor Strong ordered the police to investigate that they did a sort of a cursory investigation of this case. So the sheriff did a more thorough investigation. The sheriff Sheriff Woodward probably did more to investigate this case than the police chief. So couple that with the lack of scientific and forensic information at that time, this was not going to be solved. And my own suspicion is that Emma may have been murdered. That's sort of more the preponderance of the evidence than beyond a reasonable doubt. So, but really, I think the oldest cold case in Rochester, and one that surprisingly you don't read about in any of the things that have been written. It's William Peck, the editor of a newspaper editor and a writer, and he wrote a history of the Rochester police in 1903. And the disappearance of Emma Moore takes up about one sentence in his history of the police. And he has lots more to say about Ira Stell and that murder in 1857, but not much about Emma. And this is a case that involved hundreds, if not thousands, of people in Rochester. And as I said, it was reported across the country. The more I started, there's lots of newspaper databases, and I work in an academic library, so that's kind of helpful, and I have access to a lot of things. And the more I looked, the more articles I found in newspapers all over the country reporting about the disappearance. And they were reporting the New York Tribune, the New York Times, Daily Times. They reported on this within just a few days of her disappearance. So it was big news throughout the country. And then once again, even bigger news when her body was found in March. So that is Rochester's oldest cold case. I would assume. So, any questions? Yes.
Any word on what happened to William Whitelock?
William Whitelock had worked in a machine shop before this case, and he had injured his hand, which he used as an excuse not to go through with the marriage. That was the first one. But then he came up with two other reasons later. But after that, he was no longer able to work as a machinist. So he worked in clothing shops in Rochester, and that's where he met Emma. That's where he had met Emma initially. When he was working as a machinist, he met her in a clothing shop that he had gone into. And but he worked in a clothing shop as a clerk, and later as sort of probably more like a manager in a clothing shop. But he disappears from the city directory, and he's no longer in the city directory in 1855 and 1856, but he shows back up in 1857. And he's working at a clothing shop downtown, and he goes on to work in that field for the rest of his life. He dies in the early 20th century. He married another woman and had 4 children, and he's buried up in Holy Sepulchre Cemetery. And I can tell you that he probably didn't have an easy life for several years until people started to forget about this thing.
Yeah, it's true. He did say in the area.
I suspect that he left town for a while because the editor of the Union said that as he would walk through town, people would turn away or look at him and point at him or things like that. He had a very uncomfortable life following this incident. So the fact that he's no longer in the city directory for a couple of years, he was originally from Canada. He was from Picton, and I suspect he may have gone back to his family in Picton for a few years, but did come back, amazingly enough. He had relationships here and people that he knew, and a livelihood here. And by 1858, he's back in the city directory, and is there for the rest of his working life.
Maybe if he was guilty, he kept his mouth shut.
Yeah, and you know, I find no other evidence of anything else he was involved in. Seems like, with the exception of this, seems like a real solid citizen for the rest of his life. So, there probably is, if he didn't do it, there probably is no one who wanted this solved more than he did. Because he would have, even the third sheriff of Rochester, Darius Perhaps, he performed the first execution after the incorporation of Rochester in 1834. This was 1837. 20 years later, ex-Sheriff Perrin is traveling in Michigan, and he checks into a hotel in Michigan, and the clerk in the hotel immediately recognized his name and recognized it in connection to this hanging 20 years before in Rochester. So these were anomalous events, and people remembered them. So William Whitelock, probably, you know, for many years, had to endure that sort of those sort of looks and things like that. Yes.
I'm curious about the baby. Was the baby buried with
No,
Emma or
no.
separately?
In fact, he reports on that. The baby was a female child, well-formed, the doctor said, and that fetus was given to one of the doctors and for whatever purpose, but it wasn't buried with him. No. And I don't think her family at the time, I don't think they were in, you know, it's hard to put your head into the mind of somebody from that time, you know, whether they would have felt strongly about burying the fetus with her, or whether this was all a big scandal and we just wanted to go away. And the fact that they put no marker on the grave says something about how they felt. And you know, that's not saying something negative about them. I think that people of their own time. So that would have been a major deal. Yes.
You said that the judgment at the time was that she probably passed within a short period of time.
Right.
after she
On the
disappeared.
afternoon that she disappeared. Yeah.
And nobody's talking about her being visibly pregnant
Right.
at the time she disappeared. So that to me means that it was probably about the time she found out she was pregnant.
67 months pregnant. I mean, I can't speak for, you know, towards that with any experience, but I don't know, you know, 6 to 7 months pregnant, and maybe with the clothing of the day, maybe that could be covered. I think it will be, it's possible, because you frequently hear of women that suddenly are rushed to the hospital and then they find out that they're about to give birth. So it's possible.
Denial is a strong thing, I understand.
Yes.
So how much time between when she disappeared and when they found her?
125 days.
Okay, see, I think part of what, I
Yeah.
could be wrong, but I think part of what Steve was getting at is, if she disappears when she figures out she's pregnant, it's like, oh crap, you know, and I can't show
Right.
my face. Then she disappears to some place
It's possible.
and lives some life until she, you know, and then at 6 months, she realizes that there's no hope. And then
Right.
she,
Right.
you know, and then she either committed suicide or at that point somebody killed her.
Good theories, you know, good theories. If you were around back then, you could have talked to the editor of the Union. But we're never going to know this. We're never going to know this. And that's I guess what makes it such an enormous event in the history of Rochester. That there's this mystery still.
Did you read anything about the boyfriend gave a solid alibi, or
I'm sorry.
could the boyfriend have an alibi?
None that anybody believed. I mean, they couldn't prove anything to the contrary, but you know, he denied seeing her on the afternoon, you know, on that, you know, time when it's very likely that they crossed paths, and he denied seeing her that day, and which is, for me, is troubling.
But later that night, did he say where he was, or?
No, he claimed that he had he claimed that he had gone home and that he had gone to there was sort of a music society meeting that he claimed he went to, and he may have, but he may have committed some act in between. There's no way to tell. The chronology is impossible to confirm, and he of course knew that. You know, if he did do it, he put himself in. He tried to put himself as an alibi. Tried to put himself in public places where people would say, well, yeah, I guess he couldn't have done it, but he certainly could have. You know, but I think he clearly lied about seeing her the afternoon that she disappeared. And one of the theories was that day she had confronted him and told him that she was pregnant, which I think is very highly likely. And whether he killed her or whether he told her at that point that this is one of the theories as well, whether he had told her that he was not going to marry her despite the fact that she was pregnant with his child, or whether he killed her because she was pregnant with his child. We don't know. Yeah. But his definitely, of all the people that were questioned in this thing, and all the storylines and alibis and things like that, William Whitelocks is the one that is the leakiest. You know, it just doesn't hold water. So the great thing about this is when I first looked at this, I had to go over to Rush Reed's library and sit in rare books and special collections and look at the actual physical 1855 special edition for this thing. Now it's been digitized, and you could probably go online and find a copy of this thing. It's in a couple of databases. It's in Save It Americana, and maybe in the Happy Trust as well. I'm not sure, but there are databases that digitize these old documents and make them available with scholarship and whatever. And it turns out that this one has been digitized, so it is available. I don't know whether you can just Google it or not, but you know, go to your public library, they probably can work that out for you. Yes.
In regard to the child reception, was it common if a family member died in shame that the family would not put a stone, or they'd be afraid it would be desecrated?
Absolutely. They were, I think both of those things applied. They were afraid that, you know, in some cases, you know, say if a member of your family committed some heinous crime, they certainly wouldn't put a, they wouldn't want anybody to know that they were being buried there because it might be desecrated. Or in this case, more likely, they just felt that it was such a scandal that they didn't want to acknowledge her burial in the plot. Nobody was invited to the funeral. There was no public announcement. It was just her immediate family and close friends that attended the funeral. So, we have another example in the cemetery where somebody who I can't remember what his lapse in judgment was, but the family is all buried in the mausoleum, and he's buried outside the mausoleum in the ground. So they're very common, very common. We think for a lot of reasons, we think about 20% of the graves in Mount Hope are unmarked. They're all on the in the plot plans. You know, we know where everybody is, but there are about 20% of the graves are unmarked, and for a lot of reasons. Maybe they're 1,000 years old and nobody else in the family is still around to put a marker there. Maybe they were not that well liked in the family. Nobody was interested in spending money to mark their graves. Maybe there was a huge downturn in the economy, and nobody had the money to put the marker on. And sometimes you'll find graves where the death doesn't look like it corresponds with the material that the monument is made of. You know, that maybe it's polished granite and the person died in 1850 or something like that. And they didn't have polished granite in 1850. It was done many years later. And so lots of reasons why they're not. You don't have anything that's called a pauper's lot. The public ground is pretty much devoid of markers and a lot of the other institutional plots that for indigents, no markers there. But scandal would have been high on the list of reasons why you wouldn't put a marker. There was a serial killer at the, there was a book about it, Devil in the White City, book from a few years ago. The serial killer at the Columbia Exposition, the World's Fair in Chicago in 1893. And he was executed for his crimes. And they dumped, I don't know if it was his family or whoever, they dumped, I think, 12 tons of concrete over his grave so it couldn't be desecrated. So. And we do this Mount Hope thing so much that we can find humor in some of these things as well. Thank you.
Thank you.